At the risk of stating the obvious, a PhD thesis is a long document. Whatever discipline you're in, it will likely span several hundred pages and will have all sorts of overlapping arguments, methodologies and ideas. Plus you'll have produced it over a period of several years, and this means that even if you've done everything you can to signpost the way for an examiner, as Michel Beauduc talked about in the last section, it's still very easy for you to lose sight of the broader picture during the Viva itself. To help counteract this and to prepare for the Viva itself, we recommend that you don't just reread your thesis prior to a Viva, but augment it. What does this mean? Well, basically it means creating a version of your thesis for you to have to hand during the Viva that's useful to you, and only you. The examiners will never see this, so you can achieve this in any way you want, but fundamentally, you'll need to make sure that your copy of the thesis that you'll have to hand in the Viva is number one, navigable, so that you can find things in it, and number two, more specifically, allows you to support the arguments that you'll be making based on it. The first step in doing this, of course, is to get hold of a printout of your thesis. This shouldn't really be a final, celebratory, fancy binding, but instead something more like this, comb-bound or similar. I think this cost me about £5 in total, but it was really worth it to be able to read it again away from a screen, as several of the examiners we spoke to confirmed. It's tempting to cover your entire thesis in post-it notes. As you can see, this thesis, mine, does have a lot of notes sticking out all over the place, but there isn't one on every page. And this is because in the heat of the Viva, too many notes will probably be more of a hindrance than a help. We'd suggest a method for marking up, augmenting your thesis, something along the following lines. The first thing to do is to write short summaries of the content of each section of your thesis as you read it through again, and make these clearly accessible along the top of your thesis. This image shows how I did this in practice. The part of the sticky note that protrudes from the top of the thesis simply reproduces the title of a given section, while the text inside serves to summarise it. There's a different colour, by the way, for each chapter. These big picture notes were useful when the examiners referred to a specific page in the middle of the Viva. It meant that I could just look back a few pages from that reference and see very quickly where that particular point that they were discussing sat within the thesis. Prior to the Viva, I also strung together these short summaries into paragraphs, which gave me basically a version of my thesis on one page. This was incredibly useful, especially in the minutes before the Viva, and I took this in with me as something that no one except me would ever need to really see. Once you've got the broad strokes of your thesis marked up, it's time to get specific. I used a colour-coded highlighting system to mark up the specific points that might be touched on in the Viva. Yellow for important points, or things I might want to raise myself. Red for potential weak points that I thought might need defending and shoring up, and green for typos. I then marked out the most important ones of these with a post-it note out to the side of the thesis in that same colour. Here's an example of what I called a red note, so something I thought needed justifying or explaining. Specifically, I realised that the examiners may well end up asking why I'd introduced another text here during already quite a long introduction to a section. The note simply says, this is a long intro, but it has to be, and goes on to explain why. You can also see the post-it notes out to the side of this thesis, by the way. That's just an example of some of the ones that I used for that annotation. Here's another example of a red annotation. I'd come across, in this point, another article in the period after submitting my thesis, and I wanted to remind myself to include this in any explanation of this particular point that I wanted to make. The yellow annotations were where I allowed myself to get a little bit excited. This is where I felt that something was really important, to the extent that I wanted to be able to quote it back at the examiners myself in the right circumstances, and use it to develop an argument. My external examiner, had coined a specific term, the French of England, which was relevant to my thesis, and I wanted to emphasise how useful that term was, with some specific phrasing that would allow me not to get too hung up on it. And without the specific phrasing, I'd doubtless have forgotten what I wanted to say in the Viva itself. I was also prepared for questions on the links between my chapters. and highlighted one example of this just to give myself something else to fall back on. You'll notice there aren't any green post-it notes here, apart from this one point where I ran out of yellow ones right at the end. The reason for this is that the typos were far too numerous, and had I marked every single one with a post-it note, the thesis would have become unnavigable, as I was suggesting at the start is not what we want to happen. Instead, I actually collated the typos onto a separate sheet, which, as luck would have it, I was able to provide to the examiners at the end of the Viva. Just to show you that we all make slip-ups like this, though, I did want to show a brief selection of some of the more egregious slips at the keyboard that somehow made it through to the Viva.